Welcome to our monthly Africa-U.S. forum. This month we have two forums on two consecutive Mondays on how Africa views major changes in policies in the U.S. and around the world. Next Monday, we'll focus entirely on healthcare and medicine in Africa and how reductions in foreign aid by the United States and the UK are affecting the continent. But first, today, how African experts view President Trump. This forum is being recorded and is on the record. Video will be available later on the USC Africa-U.S. website, where you can find videos of all of these forums. Looking ahead, we'll take a break in April. Our next forum after this month will be on Monday, May 5th, World Press Freedom Day. Actually, World Press Freedom Day is Sunday, but we'll be celebrating the next day on how World Press Freedom Day affects Africa. And once again, we'll have speakers from across the continent, live streamed worldwide, and with participants in person here in Washington, D.C. Today, we have speakers from across the continent joining us. Each will be introduced in turn, and those of you who, many of you have received bios already in email, those who have not, and for those of you who want to be refreshed, we'll post links to their bios in chat as each person speaks. These monthly forums are presented by, in alphabetical order, the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and Bob Wekesa will be joining us shortly. The Annenberg Center for Communication, Leadership, and Policy at the University of Southern California, and I see Jeff Cowan, the director, and Judy and I are from that center. The Center for African Studies at Howard University, and Krista Johnson may be joining us. The Institute for African Studies at George Washington University, the Institute on Inequalities in Global Health at the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine. I see Laura Ferguson is already online with them, from them. And finally, the Public Diplomacy Council of America. And we begin, as always, with our co-convener, Bob Wekesa, USC Annenberg's inaugural Africa Fellow and Director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at Wits University in Johannesburg. Bob, over to you.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you all colleagues, participants in today's virtual meeting. Over the last slightly over 2 months since the inauguration of President Donald Trump, we've seen upheaval and the upending of the world as we knew it, or at least as we would have wanted to know it. And this has had an impact globally, of course, but with ramifications in a big way on the African continent, not least South Africa, which is a target of many of the executive orders and actions. And even as we look at impact on the European Union, on NATO, on China, and on Canada and Mexico, which have really felt the impact of things like tariffs and so forth, we must take cognizance of the fact that Africa is also heavily impacted. And so to help us kind of unpack, understand the implications of the new Trump administration, not too new anymore, and its implications on Africa, we have a very good cast of speakers, experts in their own rights, who will help us understand. So my role is really very simple. First of all, to introduce all of them. And as mentioned by Adam, their bios are on our websites, and we have actually circulated this through social media, particularly LinkedIn. You'll be able to see those profiles. And in fact, we are also going to be loading them into our chat. But first of all, we have Jeggan Johnson, who is the advocacy manager of the Open Society Foundations. He is based in Johannesburg. Second, we have Mr. Kojo Asante, who is Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Center for Democracy and Development based in Accra, Ghana. And finally, we have Greg Mills, who doesn't need much introduction, is one of the leading thought leaders on matters Africa's development, and therefore And he has actually produced a number of leadership pieces, public intellect work on the topic already. He is the founder and director of the Brenthurst Foundation based in Johannesburg. We will start with Jeggan Gray Johnson and then move on to our two other eminent speakers. And so over to Jeggan, help us understand the implications of Trump's executive orders and actions and postures along the lines of reform of global world order, the withdrawal from UN agencies, all of them, that's World Health Organization, the Paris Accord, the humanitarian entities, and so forth. And perhaps you could even link that also to what it means for Africa, even from the point of view of human rights, democracy, and governance. Over to you, Jeggan.
Thank you very much, Professor Bob Wekesa, and also to say a big hello and thank you to Mr. Adam Powell and Judy and others that have made this happen. First of all, from the onset, I wanted to double check whether you can hear me properly. Okay, wonderful.
Loud and clear.
Thank you very much. And also, before I start, I'm going to be very brief because I have to apologize ahead of time. I can't be on this call for its entire duration because I've got another set of meetings that are happening during this period. But again, Professor Bob, thank you very much for being so gracious just to allow me to start off, knowing fully well that I will not be in a position to end since I have to leave. But a couple of things that I think we need to take into consideration and be mindful of. And I'm going to start off where I left off the last time that we spoke about the Trump administration and its impact on Africa via its foreign policy or lack thereof. It's the fact that at the level of the continent, in terms of the continental leadership, particularly the African Union Commission, and that's where I want to start and then percolate down to certain country-specific opportunities. And I want to focus on those opportunities. Is that number one, this is a massive opportunity for the African Union and the leadership that actually props that up in priority policies and decision-making and shaping, particularly around its partnerships policy. And the reason why I say this is because the new administration that we have now in Addis, largely comprised of a new chairperson and commissioners, obviously the Peace and Security Commission still remains the same. But I think this is an opportunity for them to really have a rethink as to how they can recalibrate and reposition Africa's priorities in dealing again with the United States of America in terms of issues around peace and security, in issues around support to regional cooperation, and some of those imperatives, and also more importantly, in trying to find a niche to basically focus on repositioning and strategizing around the very priority that they had in basically advancing Africa's global voice on the international stage, knowing fully well that certainly the imperatives for multilateralism and UN reforms and IFF reforms around the C10 and others are largely under threat, even if it's going to be for the next 4 years. But then the question then would have is what kind of a damage can the President Trump administration do to basically roll back any progress that's been made so far, particularly around the C10 and the UN reforms, of which the AU has a vested interest and has invested, certainly diplomatically, very, very heavily around. A second issue is, again, on the multilateralism issues in terms of the reforms of the international financial infrastructure and systems. The fact that there is now a very real possibility that there'll be a new Africa credit ratings agency that is likely to come on stream, being led by the African Peer Review Mechanism, to be able to, again, foster this issue of inequalities and balance out the scales in terms of, again, the credit ratings agencies and discussions and negotiations around debt and borrowing is highly imperative and is important. The final part, again, is looking at that unilateral elements of, again, conflict and crisis directly linked by the drivers of these conflicts and crisis around the critical minerals and also just the natural resource governance as we've seen it. We did speak the last time about the transactional nature of a Donald Trump presidency, and we're beginning to even see that moving away from Europe, particularly in the Ukraine, around the critical minerals demand that's been made, to now what has been offered by President Tshisekedi in DRC with regards to Eastern DRC, the M23/Rwanda, and the other external actors that are basically taking part in that particular conflict. So in terms of streamlining that kind of transactional temptation, to be able to basically at least look at moving away from the already set normative imperatives and the shared African values around critical minerals management, particularly through the African Minerals Agency, the AMDC, that has basically looked at the Africa mining vision. That basically speaks to the fact that we can't just necessarily engage in this kind of a transactional nature to be able to basically cart away minerals without value addition. And we're doing it at this critical juncture as a way to basically use it as insurance for guarantee for peace and stability and security in Africa is not sustainable. And so there's an element for a reset in that. And I think finally, in terms of the opportunity of the moment that we see it now, the fact that South Africa is holding on to the rotational presidency of the G20. It's done so since the first week of December and then formally taken it over at the beginning of this year. A couple of critical meetings have taken place, of which we have seen a direct reluctance for, high-level participation by the United States. Marco Rubio boycotted the foreign ministers' conference and the meetings that they've had. They sent a low-level representative there. That should send a very clear signal, I think, certainly to Africa and more importantly to South Africa, especially given the onslaught now and the diplomatic tiff that's been happening between the two countries, that there has to be a strategy that basically insulates any form of progress within this particular cycle, and that only lasts for now a little less than a year, whereby South Africa holds the rotational presidency of the G20 to consolidate Africa's global voice around that and ensure that the priorities are basically acted upon and basically are ironclad as much as they possibly can be to be able to take it forward for implementation. And then secondly, the South-South imperative in terms of, again, trying to solidify the Global South's leadership in terms of, again, advancing the already triggered mechanisms for reforms at the international level, particularly also, again, given the fact that the issues around the priorities for South Africa are also maintained as we move forward, especially given the fact, ironically, that the baton would be handed over to the same adversary that we're seeing that has basically shown much resistance to the very nature and the principle of plurality, of inclusivity, of basically equity at the global level. So I'll stop there for now. I think, as I said, the threats are there, but I think there are plenty of opportunities that at least the AU, African governments, particularly leaders like South Africa and others, that are occupying very critical platforms at this very, very critical moment in time where the world is facing so much unpredictability and a lot of different threats to our prosperity and our peace, for them to basically rethink, reset, and re-strategize. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeggan. I think you've given us top level or high level points to ponder, to think about as we face these new realities of our world in major flux. I take home from this, at least from my personal viewpoint, the big point of UN reforms as advocated by the African Union. You rightly pointed out that the African Union has invested quite heavily in this, and what this means in the new circumstances is something that we'll have to focus on. I think the other point that you mentioned that I gladly take on board is the fact that the South Africa's hosting of the G20 is an opportunity, but it's also faced with challenges of US potential non-attendance. I think some people have gone as far as saying, let's not even expect the US, which is the next G20 president, 2026, will not even come on board at all. But at this point, let's move on to Mr. Kojo Asante. And Kojo, you can take it from whichever perspective you wish. We had shared the questions, but I'll be particularly interested in hearing your thoughts about democracy promotion. Over the last couple of months, in fact, you and I have been involved in some initiatives of countering malign influence from the likes of China and Russia, but more, broadly looking at some of the weaknesses in institutions that make, the consolidation of democracy on the continent quite a dicey matter. And now we have a withdrawal of the US from support of these fledgling democracies on the continent. Your take, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I hope everybody can hear me.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. And thanks again for the invitation. Really happy to be here. Yeah, I think all of us have been really agitated for the last couple of weeks as things have unfolded in Washington. And the impact of the USAID freeze and cuts in particular, I think for Ghana, where I am, has been quite significant. As you know, we are a country already under an IMF program, struggling to pay our bills, battling high inflation, exchange rate depreciation, debt issues. And the new president publicly noted that the freeze has, punched $156 million hole in its revenues. So the impact on ordinary Ghanaians is significant. 78.2 million of that amount is for the health sector, which means 150,000 HIV/AIDS patients on RLVs, antiretroviral drugs affected. There's also the likelihood that we're going to see a resurgence of some preventable diseases like malaria and tuberculosis, maybe some increase in maternal deaths, particularly in rural areas. There's also food security, because one of the areas where USAID, support was really to the agri sector and the poor northern region. It invested heavily in support of subsidized fertilizer and seeds for farmers. So, I mean, the entire economy in those 5 northern regions would also be impacted. But as you said, certainly the policies of the Trump administration are far-reaching, go and impact the world. And for those of us in the democracy, good governance, inclusive development space, these are really trying times. America was represented in many ways the standard for democracy across the world, but also represented the values of an international order, one that people aspire to. But we do know that democratic values have been declining globally in the last 15 years, and in place of that, the rise of authoritarianism and nationalism, populism, a lot of impunity arising from the fallout in globalization. And sometimes when we do the balance sheet on the issue of America being shortchanged, America was one of the beneficiaries, probably benefit most people from rapid globalization in the early stages. So sometimes when the balance sheet, the Trump administration is making this case that, well, America has been shortchanged. Yes, some of the narrative when you see it in money terms, but in terms of the leverage that soft power gave the US, there's a lot that America benefited from it. But for years, I think the first Trump administration represented a certain contestation around, long-held ideals of checks and balances, constitutional order, human rights. One would say in that first administration, there was a lot of pushback, from the bureaucracy, and maybe the administration learned its lessons. And this time around, the shock and awe tactic has disabled, the federal system, and even a lot of actors who could restrain some of these actions. But in Africa, I think one thing we should not ignore is that the Trump himself also represented a certain ideas and narratives that appealed to African men in particular, and some African publics about masculinity. Some of the issues around the anti-LGBT movement, the social conservatives, social conservatism driven by, Christian charismatic movement in America, authoritarianism and populism. And I'm sure most of you have seen some of these contradictions. So whilst Africans are fighting dictators in their countries, some who have done, less than what you would think has happened in the U.S., at the same time, they're admiring certain bravado and masculinity that's been demonstrated by Trump and people of that ilk. So the signaling is really to many regimes in Africa that oppress their people, stifle civic space, silence their critics, is to just do more, because there's no world policeman coming. And the questions you've asked about whether the EU or others can fill in the gap, that becomes a problem, because we've seen the cuts in international aid from the EU, the UK, most of it to go into spending on defense, to trade, and that is probably going to make the ability to fill in those gaps very difficult, because Europe has to also look at home, what is happening in terms of some of the changing politics and the attitudes to international aid and international order. So, but would China and others step in? Even if they step in, probably more likely to continue bilateral support. I wouldn't see more engagement with civil society, like those of us promoting democracy, because that's not what China's interest is, or Russia, or any of those. So for a lot of us in the civil space, where we are trying to counter democracy decline, this is going to be a big hole, and this is going to be a very challenging world order where might is right. The rest of us submit to the mighty rule or the rules of mighty countries, and this international web of billionaires and rich people who align with political power. And at the same time, international institutions of restraint like the UN, Human Rights Council, and other agencies are being weakened. Jeggan makes the point about the opportunities that are there for the African Union and other regional bodies to step in. But I'm in a sub-region where we've had 3 countries in the Sahelian region, formerly separate from ECOWAS. They are under military rule. We have Togo that is threatening to join them and create access for them to the sea. You have countries like Cote d'Ivoire, where there's still a talk of a 4th term. Countries like Guinea-Bissau that is able, in spite of its size, is able to tell ECOWAS, to go home. So it's not that easy to see how opportunities that we take advantage of opportunities, given the incentive that generally is driving a lot of leaders in this region, whether or not they see an opportunity to consolidate their power, because they don't have pressure coming from anywhere. And lastly, I would say, I mean, for civil society, it's really the capacity to counter democracy backsliding is severely weakened, and it will take some time to build that capacity. But one thing that you can count on civil society is that it's resilient. As I've been here in Nairobi, we're having conversations about, how to reorganize ourselves to meet the current challenges in front of us. And hopefully, we will learn how to work differently and be more independent. I look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kojo. I think you've painted quite a grim picture, but you've also ended on a prospective note that civil society will have to rethink, reorganize, boost their resilience so that we survive these tough times. We'll now turn over to Greg Mills, Dr. Greg Mills. Greg, I think you can also feel free to weigh in from any of the questions that we send. But personally, I'll be very keen to hear you out on matters to do with the implications of Trump's apparent embrace of Russia and ditching or being skeptical of NATO and the European Union more broadly. And I know that you've written on these issues in your books, in your articles, and in your TV appearances. So very keen to hear those, but also feel free to weigh in. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Bob. I will be on the screen in about 5 minutes when I reach a decent Wi-Fi. Until then, I'm on my phone in the car. Let me thank the two previous presenters, Kojo and Jeggan, for their inputs. I'd start off by making a couple of points. I mean, I think, firstly, this is a roller coaster. This is a much more than a geopolitical shift. This is a completely different way of operating, which I don't think anyone has experienced in international politics, at least since the end of the Cold War. So it's completely shaken up conventional norms, frankly, some of which needed to be shaken up a bit, and I'll come back to that in a second. I know that's not a very popular viewpoint, but I think it's one that needs to be said. From the outset, let me just say this. Over the last decade, if you're looking at this from an African vantage, it's very clear that the world is a much richer place as a whole. Wealth per capita has gone up from it's about $9,700 in 2013 to just over $11,500 in 2023, or by nearly 20%. Wealth in Asia, just to give you an idea, went up by 42% over the same period. In the United States, by 20%. Across the European Union, by nearly 17%. And in the Middle East and North Africa, by 6%. And Latin America, with 3.4%. It's only in sub-Saharan Africa, of all regions, that there's been negative GDP growth. This is per capita growth, at just around -1%, where basically economic growth has not kept pace with demographic change. So when J.D. Vance stands up at the Republican National Congress, as he did last year, and says, basically America, or there's a big chunk of America which hasn't profited from globalization, there's also a very big chunk of the world which hasn't really profited as much from globalization because, frankly, that part of the world, whether it be in America or in Africa, is not really globalized. It has not benefited from globalization because it hasn't had the means to do so. If you take South Africa, my own country, we are on average are poorer in per capita terms than we were 10 years ago. And the average wealth of South Africans has gone down in dollar terms per capita by nearly 7.5% between 2013 and 2023. We are a much poorer place as measured by global standards. So And if you match that against what's been happening elsewhere in the world, it's even a faster rate because on the rest of the world's been getting faster, our share of global per capita income's actually been declining. So that's the context. Now, into this context comes Trump with a very, as has been termed already, hyper-transactional method, a very blunt method in terms of his diplomatic language. And he has responded to the advanced view of the world, but also what he perceives as foreign policy slides in a very dramatic way. And that's particularly the case South Africa. But he's also risen the people benefiting diversity and also his views, particularly on the aid world. And frankly, parts of Africa and East African leadership should get this transactionalism because African leaders have themselves been very transactional for a very long period of time, playing one international side off against the other. And many of those international players are themselves highly transactional, if lacking the same degree of bluntness that Trump has. On aid, it's very unsurprising, frankly, that he should cut aid as a big target. America's the largest contributor to 40% of world humanitarian spending. It contributes nearly $75 billion, roughly half of global aid. And it's got very little in its mind to show for it. And in fact, if you look at Africa, where about 25 billion of that money goes, there's actually very little to show for American investment in this area in terms of this access, in I've already mentioned. So it's very tool either to deliver humanitarian assistance. And if you look at some of the ghastly figures coming out of South Sudan, where you've got like a 6% ratio in aid to delivery, it's unsurprising that this should be a target. And often aid has been much more strategic about building friendships than it's been developmental, of course. And I think he's using it as a far more hyper-strategic tool. Of course, within this, there's some punishment. And South Africa is singled out, of course, for punishment. And that's because of South Africa's policy on Israel, its taking of Israel to the ICJ. And of course, we've seen this now in terms of the removal of the South African ambassador from Washington, particularly on the development of humanitarian assistance. The record has been very weak. And then on South Africa, of course, we've been singled out for punishment, as it were, and the executive order basically taking away aid from South Africa on account of our policy on Israel and the ICJ case on Israel, and also our policies on land, has led to a sudden deterioration in relationships. Basically, the Americans have said, this administration has said, you know, you've been supporting our enemies, and we are now going to punish you as a result. And I think it's visibly likely now that sanctions will follow, almost certainly that a AGOA will be removed. But a AGOA can only be extended anyway with both houses of Congress voting for it. So it's probably likely that Africa has to look to a post-AGOA future. What's the cost of all of this? Well, the first cost is a fractured multilateral system. You could say the multilateral system is pretty fractured anyway. Maybe something constructive will come out of this destruction. I think it remains to be seen. There's a very great raising of the stakes. As we've already heard from Kojo, we are already entering, or in a long era, actually, of democratic regression. Africa has had 10 years of democratic regression. And this is certainly the absence of spending on African democracy is not going to help in this regard. You're going to see particular areas affected, like those of HIV and AIDS. But basically, the point that no one has yet made is that this cheapens the cost of authoritarian influence and alternatives. In other words, this lowers the bar of entry for authoritarians wishing to operate in the African market. And this, in a sense, by removing spending from democracy, by removing spending from a range of other civil society and even governmental initiatives around democracy, and the flow of funding in civil society movements, which act as a check and balance on democracy and on democratic alternatives, basically cheapens the cost of the authoritarian influence. So, final point is what to do in all of this. Well, it's going to be 4 very long years, minus 100 days, of course, unless Africa firstly develops a narrative and policy prescriptions to match, allowing the generation of a vision and the reality of Africa beyond aid. It's not a bad thing. Living on external dependence as a means of supplementing your budget is not necessarily good if that money is too cheap. You need to understand the cost of money. And I think Ghana under its last president did well for a brief while in developing a Ghana Beyond Aid strategy, and then went off the rails by borrowing too much. But it's very necessary for Africa to be very clear about not just spending and cutting and taxing, which is what finance is generally seen as, but the other lever of finance, which is the lever of growth, the lever of policy options and change, which we have, I think, used less frequently than the lever of spending and perhaps even the lever of. We have to find points of intersection with the United States. These may be, as has been suggested already, around critical minerals. The view already on critical minerals coming out of the US is as transactional as China, frankly. And we've it's a race to the bottom in terms of the conditionalities and standards in that regard. We need to find agreement on UN reform among ourselves and then place this in the hands of others, rather than saying it's always the US or the P5 we disagree on UN reform. We need to develop a consensus ourselves. We need to appeal to the language of J.D. Vance and other people in the world who see globalization as a threat, who see globalization as fundamentally unfair. And we need to look for what I would call symmetrical openness. We open to you if you open to us, rather than, which has been the case until now, of asymmetrical openness. And then finally, I think on aid, we need to definitely come up with a better system. It's very clear that this has not been working terribly well, at least for the majority of Africans. But perhaps Trump is doing us a favor in this regard.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for being resilient, shall we say, even as your bandwidth has been low. You've given us a couple of very good points. In fact, you have ended on the note of where do we go from here, and that is Africa looking inward as well, the so-called African agency narrative. And these are very important points. I think you've talked of the need for us to wean ourselves off aid, look at growth rather than expenditure, carefully consider borrowing against our financial needs. And I guess our viewers and our listeners, our participants, will have a couple of questions and comments. Colleagues, feel free to put those, as in the questions or comments, in the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity to revert to our speakers to help us respond to them, or at least offer comments that respond to those questions or those comments. I think at this point in time, I'll just mention very briefly that as Greg and Kojo, as well as Jeggan, have been speaking, I've been thinking in very direct terms on some of the leaders on the continent that will be, in fact, celebrating that there is a Trump in White House in Washington, D.C., in the most powerful country on earth. And indeed, the actions from Washington, D.C. have shown how strong the U.S. is. It shakes, it sneezes and the rest of the world catches a cold, as the old adage goes. But I'm looking around the continent and people like President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea, Salva Kiir, Paul Kagame of Rwanda, and so forth. And I'm certain that they're like, we are better off with the US that is not focused on us, because we are equally dictators as it is. I don't know if they describe themselves as much, but they will be very excited at the opportunity to do their own thing. And I think that then augurs quite badly for matters democracy and human rights. And I think Greg has helped us understand that the continent has been retrogressing or backsliding for nearly 10 years on major metrics to do with human rights, democracy, and governance. I think we'll now do another round of discussions. As mentioned earlier, our colleague Jeggan had to leave to attend an urgent meeting, but I'll come back to you, Kojo, and I hope this is not an ambush. But I was just wondering, in terms of strategy, both of you have actually pointed out that we need to start thinking strategically, inwardly. We should take this as an opportunity. Of course, there is a huge challenge, but all challenges can also be converted into opportunities. But talking strategy, how will we go about this? I think what we've seen from South Africa as an example representative of the continent, and with Zelensky in that White House showdown, is that there's the strategy of confronting Trump and the US, or that you lie low and wait out the 4 years, or that you actually mollify him. And I think we've seen a couple of European leaders, Keir Starmer, UK, and so forth, and Macron from France going to the White House and saying, look, we are best of buddies and we can work out things and things like those. So I wonder if you can weigh in on some of these strategies, even as we face these bigger challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think at the regional level, if the pivoting is to trade, which always happens when you get these kinds of disruptions, and I recall the Bush years where we moved to the triple D, because there was this issue about too much focus on governance and not enough on security. That there was also a pivot towards trade and security issues, but at the end there was a pushback to democracy and governance, because you need a stable country, you need a stable governance environment to have stable trade. So I think if the pivot is to trade, I mean, Africa is really looking at regional integration, and I don't think we've done enough on regional integration, even for example the ECOWAS sub-region, because even in spite of the challenges of the politics and the governance issues, the countries that are in the sub-region want to trade and to have growth. So it's, how do we organize ourselves to take advantage of that opportunity? It is not easy, as I have said, because there is a competition in terms of individual countries, with their own leaders who have interest in staying in power, also trying to chart their own path and trying to make alliances in this multipolar world. And I mentioned Guinea-Bissau, I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire, and other places. So how do you get collective action at the regional level to take advantage of what is really an opportunity to, as Greg talks about, renegotiate the trade arrangements and engagement. So there's an opportunity there, but there's also many challenges, and maybe that's where, as the civics, as civil society and other thought leaders and voice in the region, this Africa Beyond Aid agenda, maybe we should embrace it more fully so we can push our leaders to be much more focused on making the best out of this particular situation. For civil society, as I said, we tend to be resilient because we are always fighting battles and causes all over the place. So when you are hit this way, the reaction is to just step back and reflect and see how you can strategize. So for instance, I mean, we've been, as we've been talking very, bluntly about what can we do to be more independent, and so that we can continue to play a more effective role in our contest. And one of the things we are looking at is, what can we do to, leverage our legal status, to look at commercial activities that help us, to generate income to support, our advocacy, to support, our work with citizens and so on. That we really seriously look at local philanthropy, local support, but really try and put some more investment and time in that. So this, of course, these are all ideas, but they have to be executed and with the discipline and of course with the speed and accuracy that we can master. I think there are, as I said, I see many opportunities as to champion a new chapter, even for the world international order. But where is the discipline? Is the discipline, and if it's not there, how can we help sort of enable that kind of collective action? Because I think individually it will be difficult. So you need collective action on the continent to take that kind of step. Over.
Thank you very much, Kojo. I think the comment you make is quite a valid one. Being innovative and creative along the lines of income-generating initiatives for civil society organizations, rethinking philanthropy the way it has been for years, where donor funding is what makes NPOs, non-profit organizations, non-government organizations, and civil society more broadly thrive on the continent, and looking for other indigenous forms of resource mobilization. I think we take that on board, and as we go forward, these ideas that we can perhaps throw our intellectual energies into, in terms of how can they work in practical terms. We have quite a good number of questions, but allow me to just pose this question to Greg, who is now, I guess, in a better internet situation and position. And this is actually riding on Kojo's point to the effect that we have to look for other sources. But other sources of funding and ideas and other forms of resources that can help champion human rights, democracy, governance, causes, freedom of expression and so forth, with the disappearance of USAID and other funding. But Greg, do you think we still have other avenues in the US that we can still tap into? The African diaspora, businesses that work, the American businesses that do business on the continent, and African businesses that do business in the US, even though one of the executive orders basically says companies can operate as they wish. Any thoughts around us going beyond just the federal government to other interlocutors in the United States that perhaps we can still engage with? Over to you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thanks to Kojo too for the answer. And yes, I'm now back at home where I have a reasonable internet and not on my phone. I mean, there's 600 roughly American companies in South Africa. I think it's the largest destination of US companies on the continent. And they're responsible for 140,000 direct jobs. And for, it is the largest investor in the South African economy. So we would be far worse off without those activities. And I think we have to work harder to make sure that those companies are not put off by what's happening in Washington and by what the administration is saying, and that we answer some of the queries that are raised. If a goer goes, and it You know, I think it's probably seems like a better than even chance that it will, and it may be used as a punishment anyway against the likes of South Africa. That's not going to have a massive impact on economies in trade terms, but it's going to have a very big impact in terms of perception. If you're no longer part of a duty-free, quota-free trade relationship with the world's biggest market, means that for some companies they'll say, well, why is that the case? You know, what's happened? What have you done wrong? What are you a good investment market? Are you a good investment opportunity? So in the sense, it's better to be inside the metaphoric tent than outside in terms of trade relationships. And what we should do, as I say, seek reciprocal openness with the US to be able to get past this kind of idea that globalization is a one-way street, which seems to have taken root in at least this Republican Party. In terms of short-term actions, I think there's a great deal that Africa can do. I mean, the first lesson that when you dug a hole for yourself is to stop digging. And in our case in South Africa, I think we have dug an enormous hole for ourselves, but we haven't stopped digging. We keep on digging, and we keep on sticking our fingers in the eyes of the bear, which is in this case not Russia but the United States, and making it angry and aggressive and retaliatory towards us. If I was president, I would, advising the president, I would say, give Elon Musk a call, find someone who knows Elon Musk well, find someone who plays golf with President Trump, and there are plenty of good South African golfers, and make the connection. Start making the connection of Africa, and South Africa in this instance, but Africa more generally, as a partner because of what is at stake. Don't operate recklessly, operate in the interests of a very large number of people across the continent who depend on these investments and on access to this market. And you can use those intermediaries. They could be Gary Player, the famous golfer, who's a firm favorite of President Trump's, or Ernie Els, the golfer, or any one of those individuals, or Elon Musk himself, because he was born in South Africa, to be able to make that connection and start assiduously building a relationship with this segment of American society and the administration that it represents. Because it seems like it's not going to go away. So I don't think having the strategy, we're just going to hang on for 4 years and it's going to go away, is necessarily going to be proven true. We have to find a way around this and develop both a narrative and an operating system and the intermediaries that enable that change to happen. On the issue of African marketplace, it's most curious to me that we have focused mostly in Africa on tariff facilitation, on using tariffs, a bit like President Trump uses tariffs to beat people up with thick. But we use tariffs as a way of trying to stimulate, through the African Free Trade Area, for instance, trade between countries. It's actually only a part of the problem, and actually probably the smaller part of the trade problem. The other parts of the problem are that we often make the same goods, so the trade in the same goods is problematic. But a much bigger part of the problem is, and as someone who's spent a large part of his career traveling and doing route diagnostics across borders, across East Africa, across West Africa, and across just about everywhere in Southern Africa, all the way through the Congo, for instance, from ports in Namibia, from ports in South Africa, that the greatest impediment to our movement of goods is our borders. We actually use the borders as a means of extortion, of extraction. So the average trucking time is at least 1/3 driving, 1/3 sleeping, eating, drinking, or whatever truck drivers do, and 1/3 stuck at border posts, at least. And when you add into that dwelling time in our harbors, which are notoriously inefficient by global standards, then you start seeing Africa as a very difficult place bureaucratically, in terms of the frictions of moving goods around. And those are things that we can change. We don't need money to change them. We just need to change those systems ourselves with a different mindset. And really, if we want to be open to business, we need to be open to business between each other as well as to the outside world. So I think the positive, if there is a positive, that can come out of this new direction in US-Africa relations is that we look to our own resources, as has already been suggested. We look to a future beyond aid because it's proven to be such a lousy developmental tool anyway, making the donor, in fact, feel better, much better, more better than those receiving it in most cases. And then we need to look at our own internal resources to be able to reduce the costs of trade and of moving goods across the continent, because that's really where our future lies. It's the close; these are the closest markets. It's where in a generation's time, 2.5 billion people are going to exist. We should be at least, at the very least, champions of the African market. And I mean all of us, not just South Africans, all of us should be champions of the African market. But why is it cheaper to move goods from China to Central Africa through many countries than it is to produce goods in the countries next door and actually get them there cheaper? That seems to be a nonsense, and we have to act against it. So perhaps this is the right spur that we need to be able to do that.
Thanks, Greg, and we're glad we can now hear you loud and clear, and follow your argument about boosting intra-Africa trade, and basically looking at some of the issues that have been points of contention and discussion for many years, for which the present moment is an opportunity. I think we have quite a good number of questions, and in fact, we will want to invite one of our participants in the audience to perhaps speak to the historical question. I think the question being that some of the inequalities that we see in Africa arise from historical sources, developments in the past. So Professor Richard America from Emeritus Georgetown University, you're not initially a speaker, but maybe you can weigh in for a few minutes, then we return to our speakers. Over to you.
Well, no, I put in the chat a reference to a new book on the wrongful taking of trillions of dollars over 500 years from Africa by Europe and the US. And but I don't think this is the right forum to address that. I put that in as suggested reading. Be happy to talk about it
on another occasion,
at another time. The basic point, though, is that the 30 trillion, give or take, of unjust enrichment should be and can be returned through development finance assistance. That should be the basis. It is restitution to Africa for wrongful taking. I know that's a touchy subject, but
right,
sooner or later, policymakers are going to have to address this reality and this finding.
Thanks, Professor America, for alerting us to that perspective, that possibility, I think, which speaks to the global financial institutions. And as you rightly put it, this is a topic that we can weigh in on another occasion in a more in-depth manner.
Let me say that the African Union, and before that, the Organization for African Unity, held 2 conferences on this topic. I had the privilege of being invited to both of those. They were 35 years ago. The first one was in Lagos, and the second was in Abuja in 1990, 1993. This has been on the minds of African leaders for some time. They didn't have a research foundation at that time, an analytical, data-based foundation for their thinking. but they had an intuition that this factor needed to be formally, officially, and seriously included in thinking about the future and progress and relations with Europe and the US.
Thank you, Professor America. And I think, as you rightly say, we take this on board and we'll definitely follow it up at a future event, but it's worth looking at any resources that can come to the continent. This is being the year, the African Union's year of reparation. But I think I want us to move on to the next question, which is posed by our colleague Dan Witzman. This is to Kojo, and of course, Greg, you can also feel free to weigh in. The debate around bilateralism, which Trump and the US currently is pursuing, vis-a-vis multilateralism. I think Dan makes the point of Kenya, for example, having gone the bilateral way with the US during the Trump 1 administration. What are your perspectives, whether it is geopolitical, political, diplomatic, trade and economics wise? Should the continent now consider going and negotiating with Trump on a bilateral basis, or should we continue pursuing the African Union idea of collective action, of common positions, and so forth? Over to you, Kojo.
I think from a small country like Ghana, our only savior is multilateralism. I mean, the contradiction of well, I wouldn't say it's a contradiction. At least Trump has been clear how he sees the world order. I think it was left to him between America, China, Russia, and all the big countries. They would just carve out their spheres of influence and transact their business. And the rest of us have to kowtow to that world order, So, but at the same time, they are also ready to do business on a bilateral way. But for smaller countries, I mean, that is the world order that we will not get a fair treatment, even though, as Greg points out, it's not like we've been getting a fair treatment anyway. But is that a worse kind of scenario? I mean, if you look at what happened to Ukraine, that's the kind of bilateralism that you would have to deal with in this new world order. So I think it's not one or the other necessarily. Multilateralism definitely is important for the protection of the world order, and particularly protecting, smaller countries or countries that will not have the economic and political or military might to have their way in the world. That is important for, and I think after the African Union and the collective African diaspora need to see how we can evolve a new international order out of this chaos. I think there are opportunities to have that conversation about how do we, what new international order should we have that protects everybody, from oppression and so on. But at the same time, as I've mentioned, in terms of trade, there are many things that we can leverage as a collective. And if it means that you have to negotiate with the US for some of those things, why not? Even with China. And the question, with China in terms of trade and so on, is that if China is prepared to do more, what are the conditions? Is that going to favor Africa or not? So there are those opportunities, but it's just to say, for me, multilateralism for a country like Ghana is critical. I don't see how we benefit from just a bilateral arrangement.
Thank you. I'm sure,
Oh,
Greg, you also have, okay, thank you, thank you, Kojo. I'm sure, Greg, you have views on this as well. Bilateralism versus multilateralism, particularly in the trade and economics domains. But I think there's nuance to it as well. If, from what I hear from Kojo, we can have a bilateral relationship country to country with the US, but multilateralism with China, Europe, and so forth. Or at least this is the paradox that I'm grappling with here. But anyway, over to you, Greg. Maybe you can have some answers to this. Yeah.
I don't think it's one thing or the other. I think it's both things simultaneously in different forms, as ever. I mean, I know that Africa would love to operate in a multilateral framework, but it's very clear that you're trying to compare apples with grapefruit and eggs in many cases. I mean, the Sahel and the military regimes, which we've already heard about on this webinar, are not going to get the same preferential access, one would think, to the American market as countries, in the 10 countries, let's say, that exhibit democratic standards and human rights behavior, which Freedom House among countries would describe as being free. So I think you're always going to have a degree of gradation in the access that African countries require, and that's probably a good thing. I think conditionality on the basis of how governments treat their people is not a bad thing at all. Why should a military junta who have seized power illegally have the same access as a country which is striving to improve the representativity of its democracy? And I think those are accepted norms in terms of trade behavior and in terms of aid. Sometimes, as I've already mentioned, you get what they term strategic aid, where a country gets aid in spite of the fact that it doesn't have a democratic standards. Uganda would fall into this category because of its role in Central Africa and in CAR and also in East Africa and in Somalia. And it's always managed to pick up lots of aid in spite of its absence or deteriorating standards of human rights and democratic behavior. And that's why people like Bobby Wine, for instance, say very clearly that the best thing the United States should do is to do nothing, is to not support their oppressor. So it's not just being neutral in these instances, it's in fact taken the side of countries for long-term strategic reasons, which have been extremely unfortunate and I think overwhelmingly negative. So it's always going to have an element of both multilateral and bilateral. I think the bigger question is what's going to happen to the multilateral system as we know it? What's going to happen to the World Bank? Is that going to also fall within the sights of Mr. Trump? What's going to happen to the IMF? Is that going to become a tool of American foreign policy to a greater extent than hitherto? Is the bank going to slim down, as many people hope for, and push more of its staff in Washington? Leaving, developing Africa from Washington is never a very good thing, and spend more time out there doing their job in creating development in the periphery, or is it going to simply just squeeze the bank hard and start using it as more of a tool for the access of business? And I think there's a very important distinction to be made. Are you going to see multilateral or even bilateral relations focus more on commercial activities, or are you going to see them focus more on political aspects of the relationship? And I think what we have seen hitherto has been more commercial, less political. And I think from an African perspective, where we know empirically that the more democracy we get, the better we do economically, developmentally, in terms of volatility, in terms of social relations, etc., etc. We know that empirically. Yeah, there are exceptions. The counterfactual also applies as exceptions, which we can talk about. But if we know that, how is a more commercial, more monetized foreign policy going to affect that very important aspect? We know very clearly, too, that until you get the politics right, you very seldom get the economics of reform right. That's why technical solutions, which are sort of bolted onto poor political environments, tend not to work. You've got to have the right political framework in which to do development. And that framework, as I've already said, tends to be one of democracy. So if that is the case, how will a bilateral relationship or through multilateral systems like the bank, the IFC and others, how will that affect this political, economic, commercial balance, which has been vulnerable until now, but has more or less kind of wobbled forward? Will it set it back or will it make it more efficient? And I think we, at the moment, would say that it's probably going to be more commercial and less based on values, which I would say is a bad thing. So then Africa needs to have a voice. And African people need to say, this is what we want. 70% of Africans we know from the excellent polling done routinely by Afrobarometer, Ghanaian-based institution, shout out for them, they prefer democracy to any other form of government. And the reason for that is very clear, is the alternative does them very badly. It's a terrible alternative, by and large, and the history proves that. So we should resist and find the method to resist a foreign policy that tends to commercialize over values.
Thanks, Greg. I think you were also, problematized the whole issue of the bundling of the commercial and the political, and the need for a very nuanced balancing act between the bilateral and the multilateral. Clearly, there's a lot, even in just what you've said, in terms of us, those of us in academia and research and civil society, to unpack that and actually come up with a roadmap and frameworks that actually can be implemented in real time. And that's appreciated. I think we do have a question from Jeff Cowan, all the way listening to us from Los Angeles. And this question is, the impact of the death, and one can actually underline the word death, the death of the voice of America in Africa. And I think this question is beyond just issues of press freedom. And of course, this just came last week, I guess. I know colleagues, personally, I'm from a media and journalism background, so I've got to know many colleagues that certainly lost jobs, who are doing very great work. And I believe this issue of the winding down of Voice of America goes beyond just press freedom, because press freedom is part of many other rights, many other aspects of democracy. So in responding to this question, I'll just weigh in very quickly to say that, and of course, then I'll pass on to Kojo and Greg to weigh in on other democratic issues that arise out of this. One is that Voice of America for a long time was a soft power instrument for the US. It was a means of promotion of American values, which are values around democracy, human rights, and the right to choice and things like those. And we've seen that in Voice of America radio broadcasts, as well as in their text and video offerings. Voice of America also then was a bulwark against infraction of human rights. So they covered stories that local media or media from other parts of the world, particularly China and Russia, will not cover. So these would be cases of corruption, cases of wrongful imprisonment of civil society activists. I think there was mention of LGBTQ rights at the beginning, and Voice of America went to great lengths to cover those kinds of stories that many media on the continent wouldn't cover. If you're in Uganda, you do not want to abuse Museveni if you're a journalist, unless you have some, magic wand around you that you can be able to do that and not be targeted. So the disappearance of Voice of America means that African audiences are now not going to get information, news, and aspects of developments that are infractions on human rights and development. That's one. Number two, I think to build on an earlier point is that Voice of America was actually in competition with other broadcasting media entities such as Russia Today, which actually have been accused of engaging in disinformation and misinformation. The Sahel has come in for discussion quite a bit today. And indeed, that is one region where Russia's disinformation and misinformation was quite rampant. And Voice of America, came into the gap to actually point out propaganda as a strategy for the involvement of what was then called malign actors, who are not very keen on stable democratic governance and so forth. And this will also then largely apply to other countries, media from China and so forth, which have established themselves quite a bit on the continent. I think the disappearance of VOA then gives them a pass to then do as they wish. But I think the third and final point is that Voice of America was also a trading entity in and of itself. Lots of the journalists who are employed by Voice of America were Africans based in African countries, broadcasting, in fact, in vernacular languages in some instances, such as Swahili and so forth. And some of them will then move on to other local media, domestic media offerings. So I think this then means that the content has lost an opportunity for training, not just in terms of thoughts and philosophies that bend towards democracy, but also in technicalities of actual production of news features, of hard news, of commentary, and so forth. And so I'll stop there for now in response to that question. I can see Jeff's hand is up. Maybe you can weigh in before we move on to Kojo and Greg.
I asked this for a very particular reason. As people on the call, some will know, some won't. I'm your partner and Adam's partner in this series. But I used to run the Voice of America, and I'm engaged currently in the effort to save it. It's a very it's an uphill battle, but not impossible. And I think Americans don't tend to understand what it means to people in different countries. If people on this call have examples of why it's mattered in their countries, that they want to bring to our attention and want to send a note to Bob or to Adam or to Judy, or to me directly if you have my email, I'd like to know it so that we can put those examples from the field into the dialogue that's going on in Congress and elsewhere.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that's an important call out. We'll definitely do something, and we'll also reach out to a few other colleagues in the media space to see if there are any views and comments and cases and stories to share. But I think having wended in, taken over from a moderator role to a speaker myself because of a passion for journalism, I'll now come back to Kojo. Or Craig, I think you're ready to weigh in on this. Whoever, I think all of you are ready. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll go very quickly. Kojo doesn't mind.
Yeah.
Just to say, I'm a great fan of VOA. I've been interviewed on VOA many times. The problem with VOA's disappearance is that, as I mentioned earlier, that space is now afforded to others with a much less open, liberal message of transparency and tolerance and democracy. I mean, are we going to tune into RT now? Are we going to tune into China stations? What are we supposed to do? It's basically giving up with no fight at all to a message of authoritarianism. And that's not a message that the majority of Africans, to cite Afrobarometer again, want to hear. We want to hear about diversity and transparency and openness and ways in which we can improve ourselves through equality. And I think the VOA's closure, or seems to be pending closure, is a tremendous loss to American interests primarily, but also to democracy in Africa. So if it can be reversed, I think it'll basically, it's a hard-earned space that the VOA has created for itself, and if it can be turned around, it should be.
Over to you, Kojo, on
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, these things come back to ideas, right? I mean, and some of the reasons for basically shutting down VOA was the idea that the journalists or those who worked at VOA had the temerity to criticize the great leader, you know, and I mean, even in Ghana, you know, the suggestion that the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, which is a state media outlet, cannot show somebody who is criticizing government policy or criticizing directly the president, and by doing that, it is not serving the interest of the state that's representing. It's quite bizarre. Because, I mean, how would people internationally view the US if they cannot appreciate the diversity of voices in the US? So if the whole idea of a state media or broadcasting, you know, entity is to basically do government propaganda, then what's really is the point? So I mean, when such ideas are being advanced and you see people rationalizing it, that, oh, you know, you should be smart, you shouldn't be criticizing the leader, you know how the leader is, he might take action against you, and therefore everybody is self-censoring. That is not democracy. That is not even good governance, because then really you don't really know what people are thinking in their homes. And that always creates a source of instability for any state. So it is really odd for some of the actions that has happened. But of course, for a lot of Africans who are living with dictatorships, who maybe listen to Voice of America for inspiration, now they have to look for somewhere else to get that reinforcement of values, and, as you know, an inspiration to continue to stay in the fight wherever they are. So it is really sad, you know, but it's just, I think for me, that's where I worry about some of it's really the contestation of really long-held ideas that are really not, I don't see them as issues that really, these are basic, sensible, commonsensical values and principles that throughout history, we've all experienced, and yet it's been contested as if it's what is making America weak, for those who see it as that, and that America being strong is to just be more authoritarian and broad shoulder over everybody, and which I find very, very surprising.
Thanks, Kojo. As you're speaking, I was actually just thinking of a recent report by a Swedish organization called Civicus, which has basically, and I think colleagues can look at that report. It kind of suggests that now the US should be ranked as an authoritarian country or something to that end. Of course, the US has produced many US organizations and institutions. National Endowment for Democracy, and the IRI, International Republican Institute, name them. They have been on the forefront of promotion of these values, and now they are under siege. And one of them, of course, Freedom House has always produced these rankings of countries in terms of freedom of expression. Now the US itself is under the spotlight, which is quite an interesting reversal. But I think proceeding on, and I want to pose this to Craig, this question of, so far there's been quite a lot of talk from the African continent, but not much action by African leaders. This is also a question from one of our audience. And as I process this question in my mind, I'm just looking back to the letter that you wrote, Greg and others, a letter to Trump in January. And building on that, what exactly should African leaders be doing? Of course, some, like Cyril Ramaphosa and perhaps Kenya's Ruto, have engaged a bit, but others have just kind of kept quiet for the most part. What advice can we give to African leaders on some action to take? Or are they even in terms of being, inaction is also action in a sense? Yeah.
Well, I would strongly advise, thank you very much. I would strongly advise that you don't do what we've done in South Africa, which is just simply turn this into a clanging match and a war of words with great cost to the South African public. Now, you've got in South Africa a party, the ANC, representing 40% of South Africans, the South African voters, which has taken a very strident line on foreign policy matters, which it regards as its preserve, even in a government of national unity. And the day after, President Ramaphosa basically said, we will not be bullied in Parliament at the State of the Nation address in February, the day after Trump issued his executive order and said, well, basically, if you think you're not going to get bullied, well, here's some bullying. And basically removed all aid from South Africa at great cost to HIV/AIDS researchers, sufferers, and the TB sufferers as well, and the research that goes behind it. And this cost is going to have to be borne now by the South African taxpayer. Somehow, which we're already very stretched, there's been a massive fight in our parliament about increasing value-added tax in order to be able to essentially pay for government's expenditures, not least the civil service expenditure, and they want an above inflation increase. And so this is really having a dramatic impact in terms of domestic politics and domestic political tension. So I'd strongly advise not to do what we have done, and that is to go and seek a punch-up with a much bigger person that could, or country in this case, that could in some ways help you and has historically helped you. I do think that you need to find common cause. And as I mentioned already in the case of South Africa, you could probably use the good offices of Elon Musk to do so, appeal to ego if necessary, and be able to find conduits into the White House at this point. Because the cost is dramatic for the South African public. There are many millions of people who depend on this relationship and on the health of this relationship. And we have to structure it in a way that survives the vagaries of individual leadership. It becomes a relationship between peoples, not necessarily between presidents and administrations. And I think generally for Africa, most African leaders have kept their heads down in all of this. They've tried to stay and duck out of any possible controversy, except for President Tshisekedi in the Congo. Of course, he's kind of said, well, I'm here to be a partner of the United States. I'm endowed with critical minerals. You want critical minerals, Messrs. Trump and Musk. Let's make me a deal and help me with my security problems in the eastern part of the country. And it's kind of a reverse transactionalism that's going on there. That hasn't manifested in any particular deal yet, but that has already happened. That's maybe quite a long way down the spectrum. But in the middle is this idea of symmetrical openness. Is we want to be a partner with American corporations. We want to be a partner with the American economy. There's a lot of people of African descent who live in the United States. We feel a connection. There's a historical connection, of course, and we want to translate that and cement that into an economic form, which is about access, which is about scholarship, which is about trade, which is about capital flows, stuff that we need to be able to get out of our growth mire. We are mired in a situation of very high demographic growth, increasing debt, particularly in some of our more prominent countries, becoming unsustainable, and democratic, as I said already, regression. The 3Ds. Democracy, debt, and demography are all working currently against us. And we need to turn the situation around to our advantage. A young population, a relatively very cheap labor demands, relatively speaking, open economies, we can do that. A lot of upside in the relationship and turn us into a business opportunity to be entertained rather than something to be avoided or transacted in a manner that we've seen elsewhere. And so I think there is a way to do this. It's going to demand some thinking about, and it's going to involve much more than shooting from the hip. And the reality is, this may not just be a flash in the pan in the United States. We may have this administration for some time to come. Who knows? And we have to prepare for that contingency and structure a relationship around values and around people, not just presidents and personalities, because that's going to, I think, inevitably suffer the consequences of the changes that happen every 4 years, or more frequently if you consider the African turnover as well into that equation. So that would be my advice: find those conduits, find those people who can restructure this, and try and avoid some mudslinging and the confrontations that seems to be characteristic of our world currently.
Thanks, Greg. And over to Kojo, building on Greg's view that we did restructuring. In fact, that was his very final, intervention or comment or perspective on this. I'm just wondering, you weighed in a bit earlier around the incapacities or challenges that the ECOWAS faces, and many have commented that the African Union, which is the continental body, equally has quite a number of deficits, but it has also tried to the best it could. So this restructuring of economic models, restructuring of the internal political dynamics of the continent in view of what has happened in Washington, D.C. Do you see it happening at continental AU level, at the regional economic communities, the 5 regional economic communities, or internally countrywide? And how will that work? And is that even feasible? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, ECOWAS has opportunities. I mean, ECOWAS will be 50 years, I think, the May or so. And for a lot of us who work in the sub-region, we've been pushing very hard for serious reforms with the ECOWAS Treaty and a number of its protocols, because the narrative is that the value is the same, whether there's unconstitutional changes in government under military rule and constitutional coup d'etats, that you have, governments that are elected constitutionally and yet behave like military regimes who, suppress the civic space and basically oppress their citizens. So what really is the difference? And I mean, for ECOWAS to, regain some level of credibility to really drive the region in a different path, and also forestall or stop this hemorrhaging of countries, deciding to leave, because there's a lot of vulnerabilities. It has to signal a different path. And certainly one is fixing, the governance challenge and making sure that, constitutional order is enforced. But, ECOWAS itself lead that charge. There are countries in ECOWAS that sort of have the moral standing to lead some of that conversation. Ghana is one, Senegal is one, even Liberia and others who can, Cape Verde, leave that challenge. But I think because the treaty itself, and we have to remember that it was under a lot of military leaders were involved in setting up ECOWAS in the first place. The focus has been on security issues, peace and security issues, to the neglect of the economy imperative. And given the kind of youth unemployment challenges and the kind of things that are driving some of the politics, I think it's, really paying serious attention to the trade opportunities can begin to help also drive a different narrative in the region. So I think the REX might be in a stronger position. I think the SADC area, the East Africa area, the opportunities there are, really driving the trade agenda. And that makes continentally a little more easier for AU, to coordinate some of these efforts. But I think for ECOWAS, at least, there has to be a real engagement on trade and growth, as Greg is saying, as a way of, you say whether it's a palliative, but it's a way of keeping people hopeful about the democracy experiment, because it's responding to the development question. And people need to feel and see that there is a real effort, towards that, even as we try to fix the democratic governance. Over.
Thanks, Kojo. I'll now come back to Greg, and I think really pose the similar question. How do you see, now that we almost agree that we need to take a back seat? I hope we are not going to be isolationist, but we have to look for internal means of renewal, renaissance, as well as fending for ourselves now that the US, at least for the next 4 years, might not be where we look for democracy promotion, for holding the values. And I think Kojo has kept on harping on the notion or the idea of values, that we have to do that internally. But in terms of practical terms, how do you see it panning out at national, regional, and AU levels? Because, and I think all these, conglomerations or formations have their own institutions, DEPAD or AUDA at the AU level, and the various mechanisms like organs within SADC and so forth. Or should we, over to you? I guess you get the point. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think we're world champions at issuing reports. We have a veritable alphabet soup of institutions, many of which are underpowered and certainly undercapitalized in terms of political will, as well as resources. We talk the talk, but we seldom walk it. As you were speaking, I was just received a note, which is a statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Qatar of today's date. And of course, the Qataris are busy negotiating, as it seems to become their forte, some sort of fleet, I guess, or at least rapprochement in the Eastern Congo between the DRC and the Republic of Rwanda. And I think, you could say, well, why isn't the United States doing this? Why isn't the European Union doing this? The Qataris are doing this, I guess, because there's a role for a small country with lots of money and a special relationship with Rwanda in particular, that wants to play this kind of mediation role. But the question is really, so after all the efforts of SADC, of the EAC, of the AU, the Qataris have to do the deal. Well, what does that say about the African Union? What's it say about African agency? What's it say about our abilities to make peace and do business on our continent? Why does it take somebody to come from outside to be able to do this? And so we bemoan the European agency, and there's a deep history there, of course. We bemoan American agency. There's a shorter, but nonetheless, history there too. We sometimes bemoan Chinese agency. That's more of a moan from populations rather than leaders. The Russians don't really have a role. It's kind of on the margins. But other people come in and we don't really say, well, why weren't we able to pull that off? So I think we structure all these institutions, but the political will to actually draw this all together and the threads that bind us are very limited. And so we don't have anything to pull on. We actually don't. One of the common threads between Eastern Congo and South Africa, other than our Africanness, there's a geographical notion, but actually there's no real interest. There may be some rivalries, actually more than shared interests. Certainly with Rwanda, there are rivalries, and we don't find the means to be able to manage it. Sometimes our differences trump our commonalities. So I think that, and it goes back to the point about trade. You know, we talk about an African free trade area, but there's so much that can happen before 2063, I think it is, in terms of building systems and flows of trade and traffic that don't require massive investment, that don't require yet another summit in some country of people gorging at the buffet table to be able to tell us that the free trade area is on track. What it requires is not one-stop shops. It requires one-go agencies at every border post. Border posts should be like they are in Europe. The thing that you approach at 60 kilometers an hour and it flashes past you because that's the border today. Instead, they become points of extortion, points of extraction, points of value for bureaucracy over the interests of people and the interests of people trying to do business. So I do think we've got this the kind of wrong way around. We talk about agency, but we don't act on it. We don't find the methodology to be able to do it. And, you know, we face today in the Horn of Africa a massive humanitarian crisis that absolutely dwarfs anything that we have seen in Central and Eastern Europe since the start of the war in Ukraine. I mean, maybe we don't know because reportage is so low. As many as 1.5 million people have been killed in the various regional and sub-regional conflicts that take place there. We know that in Ethiopia, that the situation in Tigray is fragile. The situation in the Amharic region is fragile. The situation in the Oromo region is fragile. The situation between Ethiopia, between Addis and Asmara is fragile. Anything could happen. There's an ongoing state of civil war within Ethiopia itself, which seems to be settled for some time and then re-erupts again. So we talk about these institutions at a level which seemingly bears no resemblance to what's actually happening on the ground. We talk about peace between countries when we can't actually make peace in our own countries. You know, in my own country, 86 people die every day in murders. It's an extraordinary number, one of the highest rates in the world. But we don't really factor that in. And when we think about how do we build systems of governance and institutions within our own countries, we talk about global architecture and global governance as if it's some form of abstract. We don't talk about it in terms of the reality of people's lives and the grind of poverty and the difficulty of extracting yourself from poverty and the role that government could and should play in these instances. So I would ask, maybe Trump offers us an opportunity to kind of honest up with ourselves, honest up about our talk, honest up about our institutions, honest up about the degree of political will that we profess to, but we very rarely exhibit. And perhaps that will give us an opportunity to show what we're capable of. And it's funny that somebody from outside has kind of energized us to think about our future. Why is that the case? Why don't we do this without a Donald Trump? But anyway, he's here, so we should use him as a spur, as I said, to think about our failings and the things that we're in control of, not that he is in control of.
Thank you, Greg. I think that the note, you really analyzed the situation on the continent, and there are many flashpoints, many of which the U.S., of course, has been involved in, as you rightly put it, including, envoys that are sent to Great Lakes region, to the Horn of Africa, AFRICOM, which was the African Command, is now being wound down into the European Command and so forth. So indeed, perhaps this is an opportunity for us to develop homegrown solutions so that we are self-reliant, as it were. I'll come to Kojo, and I think we do have only a few minutes left. I'm not too sure, Kojo, if this is an issue you can respond to, but let's take it as we go. And this is about leveraging African diaspora as an avenue for many of the discussions we've had today, trade and maybe issues of governance as well. And I say this because Ghana has been held up as an example of how to tap old and new African diaspora. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that?
I recall that when President Akufo-Addo, as part of his foreign policy, this economic independence agenda, that he tried to lead the Ghana Beyond Aid, which kind of fizzled out maybe a year after. The presidency set up, or actually, set up an office of the diaspora and appointed a director for it. And even the current regime has kept that. And the whole idea was, as some have talked about, was to facilitate, the return of Africans who, have lived and grown up and accumulated some capital to come back and invest. I can't say, because it will be very anecdotal, how successful that has happened. I know, at least in terms of the return of African Americans and other African diaspora through the year of the return and things like that, there's been some successes that people can point out, but not in the larger sort of commercial effort to attract, some sort of FDI, into the country. But maybe others have done studies that look at that. But I think that model has potential, really. But it cannot be just a branding issue. The product must also reflect the brand. So if you brand it and the people taste the product and they have regrets, then the word will go out that, it's all a sham at the end. And I think that's what has happened to some of the efforts that has gone around. So I completely agree that, you see where we are, and as Greg points out, there's really a lot of challenges with leadership. But the point is, at the end, as citizens of the continent and in the diaspora, we suffer if we have bad governance and if our leaders don't lead. So it's really up to civil society, it's up to citizens to lead their leaders and persuade them to act. And that's what I think some of us have been trying to do, because we cannot wait on the sidelines waiting for our leaders to wake up one day and realize and smell the coffee and know that, they need to do the right thing to solve all the problems that we are confronting. And I think the more coordination that, different groups of civil society, different groups of citizens have in sort of pushing the agenda that, this has happened, we need to respond. These are some of the ideas that we have on the table. Can we try some of these things? Can we execute and begin to, address what we are being confronted with? I think it's those kinds of attitude that is going to take us the right path. I don't think that giving all the contradictions and the perversions that exist among African leaders and so on, you can just rely on whether the regs or the to have the collective action. It has to be citizens who are pushing this agenda as well and making sure that there is, their leaders hear it loud and clear, and then they act on it. So I completely concur with the question on diaspora, and I hope that more of these initiatives can be initiated. But as I said, the brand must match the product. Over.
Thank you, Kojo. I think as you're speaking, there are quite a good number of us here who are, place branding and national branding, public diplomacy, soft power scholars and practitioners who will appreciate Simon Anholt's point that you do not sell a shiny wrapping, but rather you work on internal aspects, mechanisms, issues internally. Then you'll sell yourself. If transferred to a nation, then I think we do. Your point makes a lot of sense that you can, and I think then that comes to the role of civil society in making sure that systems work and diaspora will follow, and indeed any other economic activity. I think we are only a couple of minutes to the top of the hour. I'll give each one of you 2 minutes. I wish I could give you more, but to just wrap up your final thoughts, and this could be perhaps anything we've discussed, or if you look in your crystal ball, what should we expect going forward? And that would be on any point. I'll start with Greg, then Kojo will come in, and I'll then move on here.
I think the some of the comments, which I'm reading with much interest, and I'm very pleased to be on this very active forum, and congratulations to you, Bob, and to the University of Southern California for hosting it. And it's a very important time for us to talk about these things, and dialogue is going to generate the ideas, and thus hopefully some of the solutions to find a better way out of all of this stuff. I think one of the insights is that this is a great opportunity, for a wake-up call. In every crisis there's opportunity, as the cliche has it. And I think we need to look at some of the things that we've been doing in the expectation that there will be a different result. One of them is aid. We've been spending billions of dollars every year, the world has, on aid, which is basically money from richer taxpayers to poorer populations. And it's had very limited developmental impact. In fact, many would argue, famously William Easterly and Lisa Moyer, for instance, aid has had a negative impact for a whole variety of reasons, not least that it's reduced the link of accountability between leadership and their populations. And I tend to agree with that view. I don't think it's all bad. I think there's many areas where aid has made a significant contribution, not least in humanitarian assistance and in health assistance, as we have discussed. But there are many cases where it's actually not really helped. It's removed the incentivization. It's become a crutch rather than the hand up that we need. It's become a hand out. And we become too used to it. It's been factored in by governments as a kind of a freebie. They have to pretend to do one thing and they get the money from Western donors on the other, and nothing really changes. And I think what faces us as Africans is this imperative for an end to business as usual. We faced this before Trump. Our growth was too low. Our demographics were changing very rapidly. Our debt situation was turning not in our favor in many countries. And it was a bad picture before Trump. And it was worsening all the time. So we need to use this wake-up call, as it's been termed by some, as an opportunity to end business as usual, because it wasn't delivering what we require. What we require is higher growth, more equitable development, which comes with better democratic systems and accountability, and more investment by locals, by foreigners, by whomever to invest in our economies, because that's what's going to lead to more growth, and that leads to something of a virtuous cycle. Of course, we've had growth, but it's not kept pace with population growth, and this is an opportunity to change all that. So maybe in 4 years' time, hopefully, we'll be saying thanks, President Trump, for the spur to do things differently. I hope that that's the message we take out of this rather than doom and gloom.
Right. No, thank you, Greg. And of course, we'll continue conversation between our institutions, Brenthurst, WITS, University of Southern California, and we'll be in contact to see how we can work together. Over to Kojo, your final thoughts on this.
Yeah, one dimension that I didn't mention, but that probably for later discussion, is this billionaire alliance that we are also experiencing as they increasingly weigh into politics, as another form of power grab. We're also seeing on the African continent a lot of financiers of political parties decided to step into the ring themselves and entangling the state in their business interests and then refusing to leave. So there's all these dynamics around capital and how it relates to politics and what implications it has for good governance and democracy, not just local, but globally. But I just to echo Greg's point, I think it's a wake-up call, but Africa has gone through many shocks and we didn't reform. So sometimes you hope that this time around people will wake up, but it's still yet to be seen whether that would happen. But at least I can say from our side that we will mean to push much harder on really reimagining our space and how to really confront some of these challenges. But thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. I think the two of you have done us a great favor, a great honor, and definitely you have given us new ways of thinking about this topic, and the conversation continues because here we have a foundation, an academic institution, we're all think tanks in some form or shape, and we have civil society, and I think this is why Kojo has been insisting on a ground-up approach. It looks like we might need synergies to align and work in sync to see some of these proposals come to life, as it were. But at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Adam Clayton Powell, to take us to the end of the program. And we shall be producing a report soon, which we shall share with all. Thank you very much. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to our speakers, Kojo Asante and Greg Mills, and those who joined briefly in our audience. All of you who joined, there's a reason we call this the Africa-U.S. Initiative and the Africa-U.S. Forum. It is because we want to hear from speakers and experts in Africa. And I think that today's session has been an excellent example of exactly what we want to hear and how it is different, I think, from so much of what we in the United States hear from Africa. And on that note, 1 week from today, we're doing a second program this month. This will be entirely on impact on healthcare and medicine. I put the RSVP link into chat. Many of you already have it, and we hope you will join us then. Until next week, I thank you again for joining us. I thank you again to Bob for being our co-convener. And so until next Monday, we're adjourned. Thank you for joining us.